I'm Christopher Carey, and this is the first tutorial in a series of tutorials covering the basic techniques I use for coloring light flesh tones. In this lesson, I'll be laying in flat color washes as a foundation for the layers of color I'll apply later. The first marker I'm going to start with is an E50. It's kind of a cool, light flesh tone that's more yellow than red. I've seen a lot of other tutorials on coloring skin, and in most of them, the go-to base color seems to be E00 or possibly E01. The E0 range of colors is a bit too warm for my taste. I like to start cool and lay in my warms over the top, since my approach to coloring skin is based on warm-cool transitions rather than value transitions. Most Copic artists use the value method when coloring skin. In that method, you would start with an E00 to lay in your base color, and then move to an E01 or E02, and finally finish off with your darkest areas with an E03 or E04. The problem I have with this approach is that all the colors are very similar in hue and color temperature, and that's just not the way real skin looks. Real skin is translucent, and its color is affected by the colors of the tissue and the hemoglobin underneath it. It's also not the same color from one area to the next. For example, the skin on the nose appears to be a different color than the skin on the cheeks because it's thinner and tightly stretched across bone and cartilage. Because it's thin, the blood is closer to the surface than it is on other areas of the face, which makes the nose look warmer and redder. The other issue I have with the value coloring approach is it doesn't really work that well for coloring female portraits or figures. When I think of the value approach to coloring skin, I instantly think of Rembrandt, who was a master of the technique. But if you look at his female portraits, he really doesn't use large areas of light and dark. Instead, he uses warms and cools. When using a warm-cool approach to flesh tones instead of a value approach, I like to look at the work of William Bouguereau rather than Rembrandt. Bouguereau's flesh tones are built almost entirely on warms and cools, with very little change from light to dark. You can see this by desaturating one of his paintings, so it's just a grayscale image. When you do, you'll notice that the skin has very little value change from one area to the next. Okay, so what I've done here is layer in a flat even base of E50 for her skin. In a subsequent tutorial, I'll work back into this with grays and blues and purples to create the effect of a believable flesh color. So next I'm going to color her lips. When using Copics, I often like to lay in my lighter values first, and then layer my darker colors over them. This technique works really well, especially when you work in a close value range like I do. In the value method of coloring, the tendency is to use gradations based on the last number of the Copic cap. If you look at a Copic cap, it has an alphanumeric color code embossed on it. The letters indicate the color family. The first number represents the blending family, and the last number represents the value of the marker. In a warm-cool coloring method, we want to look at the first number on the cap instead of the last. It's easy to blend very different colors when that first number is the same or close to the same. So, what I've used for her lips is an RV00. It's a nice, cool red violet. And now I'm going to warm it up with a little R11, just to give it a little separation in the corners. In this tutorial, I'm going to lay in the flat, unblended colors on all the areas of her face first. So I'll go ahead and lay in a warm W2 color on the white of her eyes. This may look too dark right now, but when I put in the lashes and shadows around her eyes, it's probably going to be just right. I'll use a YG03 to color in her irises. The bright green is going to create a nice split complementary with the purple I'm going to use in her hair. I already know how the colors I'm using are going to work together because I did a small color study to work out the relationships beforehand. For important works that I'm going to show or sell, I always do preliminary studies to work out the specifics of the drawing. So when I start on the actual work, I already know how it's going to look finished. I'll work out the line weights, value structure, and color relationships separately, and then combine them in the final drawing. So for her hair, I'm going to lay down a base with BV00. What I'm after here is the lightest color that's going to be in her hair that's not a highlight. I use a lot of different techniques for the highlights in my drawings, but for the hair, I like to use the white of the paper whenever I can. The technique I'm using here is called the flick technique. It's a technique that Copic teaches in their Copic certification classes, where you use a fast flicking motion to lay in the color. The shape of the mark that flicking makes is kind of pointed on both ends, which makes it really well suited for coloring hair. At this stage, it's important to get the hair completely blocked in, since its color and value will have an effect on how the colors of her face appear. If I were to finish out her face completely before moving on to her hair, the possibility of a mistake I can't back out of gets pretty high. So for me, it's just easier to lay out an overall color structure. I'm leaving the marker work in the hair really sketchy. I'm not worried about trying to hit a finished look, and since it's hair, the linear strokes produce a nice textural foundation to build on. The paper that I'm using is Strathmore 300 series smooth Bristol board. It's tough as nails and will take a ton of layers. It's also pretty absorbent, so the ink has a tendency to bleed more than it would on a paper with a more finished or glossy surface. But in my work, I count on the bleed to help me create the super soft color transitions that I use to create the illusion of form. I've tried a ton of other papers, but I keep coming back to this one, since it suits my working methods best. Okay, so I have all the base colors laid in, and I'm ready to start to build out the form. We'll start that process in the next video lesson.